Q&A and comments.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here at the East-West Center. I've read a lot of your research, and to have so many people sacrificing a beautiful afternoon is a real honor. So thank you all very much for taking the time. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the changing geopolitics in the Pacific, and obviously a big component of that story is China, because China is a big component of pretty much every story. And this summarizes a little bit about what's happening in the Pacific at the moment. This is the captain of a PLA Navy ship, one of two ships that visited the island kingdom of Tonga in 2010. That's the ship as it's coming into port.
That's not the horn.
And this is the captain of the ship. And he's shaking hands with ethnic Chinese who live in Tonga. And the first day that the ship arrived in port, the two ships actually, the ships were only open to ethnic Chinese who lived in Tonga. And they were brought on the ship, and they were given a tour of the ship. And then on the second day, the ship was open to the general Tongan public. So it's an example of the sort of outreach and diplomacy that China is doing extremely well throughout the world, and you can see very clearly in the Pacific. That's China, and we know China is in the Pacific as it should be if it has a smart foreign policy. It's the smart thing for it to do. What's very interesting is there are increasingly entirely new, unexpected players coming into the Pacific. So this is a photo that was taken last week at the UN General Assembly in New York. These are some of the dozen or so Pacific Island leaders who signed what sounds like a very boring document, but I'll explain why it's quite important later on, which is about having a data repository in the Pacific for renewable energy. The leaders came together and signed the document and handed it, as you can see, to Ban Ki-moon. This effort was largely bankrolled by the UAE. There are entirely new dynamics coming into play in the Pacific, and how that plays out is going to be extremely consequential for global balance of power and security. The core reason why these changes are happening, I believe, is because different countries have different priorities for how they're interacting in what apparently seem to be marginal issues. It seems like a bit of a leap, but one way of looking at it or describing this dynamic very clearly was a discussion that was captured between, seems odd, but some U.S. officials and the directors of Gazprom, the director of foreign relations of Gazprom in 2008, about what are the corporate priorities of Gazprom. So Mr. Zolotov was asked, and he answered, our priorities are to fulfill the gas needs of domestic, industrial, residential consumers, and to fill social obligations, which include a variety of, in effect, charitable projects throughout the country. This is essentially a domestic security agenda. They're going to use the gas to make sure that the population is secure and stable and not rising up against the government. The Americans said, you're a corporation, right? Aren't you supposed to maximize shareholder value? Isn't that what corporations do? And Mr. Zolotov replied, oh yeah, I forgot, actually we have another priority, and that's to maximize control over global energy resources. So we are seeing very different approaches to international relations coming into play. And one way of describing it is to say it's very broad, can be really analyzed, but some countries are sort of playing monopoly and some are playing risk. And we see this very, very clearly in the Pacific. And we're going to take as an example of this, the case study for today, is the Kingdom of Tonga. On paper, there's very little reason to be interested in the Kingdom of Tonga. It doesn't have a lot of resources. It's okay, strategically positioned, but not hugely well positioned. In fact, you can see here, Tonga is sort of very much at the edge of the map, if not off this map. Right? So what happened after the end of the Cold War was we kind of got to this, we had the West, this end of history syndrome. We won. We don't really have to deploy in these out-of-the-way places anymore. We can kind of get back to making money. And what happened specifically in the Pacific was we outsourced security to Australia and New Zealand. And in 2006, For example, the UK, which was very strong on intelligence and understanding of the region, actually closed 3 high commissions in the Pacific and pulled out completely. And there's this kind of incredible newspaper article where, New Zealand is now Britain's eyes and ears in the Pacific. And on paper, it looks like Australia and New Zealand really do have control in the Pacific. If you look at Tonga, for example, Australians and New Zealanders are embedded in every major ministry, including justice, health, education, finance and planning, environment, the post office. And these are not marginal positions. The IT system for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was set up by a New Zealand aid worker, which means obviously they have access to that entire system. The Commissioner of Police is from New Zealand. All of the judges are either from New Zealand or Australia, or maybe UK, but usually from New Zealand or Australia. So on paper, it looks like a really effective control. But we've seen China's moving in, we've seen UAE's moving in, and others, Russia's coming back. So what's gone wrong from a Western perspective? Well, we all know the concept of soft power, but what do you call it when you use soft power to get people to hate you? Because whatever you call it, that's what Australia and New Zealand have done with the Pacific Islands. And this is an example. There was a New Zealand television show, a sitcom called Diplomatic Immunity, which is shown on the state broadcaster in New Zealand. And the premise of the show is that there's a New Zealand diplomat who commits a terrible indiscretion. He's caught in the back of a taxi with not a lot of clothes with one of the British members of the royal family. So he needs to be punished. So how is he punished? He's punished by being sent to go work in the consulate of a Pacific island. That's the starting premise of the show, right? And then, hilarity ensues as all these wacky Pacific characters run around and do wacky Pacific things. This is an example of one of the characters on the show. You can see, if you go to diplomaticimmunity.tv, you can see all of the characters on there. So this is one of the characters. Her name is Suga. I'm going to read from her official bio. Suga is a niece of the cousin of the king. She has come to New Zealand to marry a rich white man and to have many babies to him. She has set about this task with a religious zeal that some might call stalking, but which she maintains is just fulfilling the destiny of her people. Suga is a bit unhinged and a lot scary. She is officially the Consulate Tourist Affairs Liaison. This is like... All right, you got it, right? This is not soft power as we know it. And it's not just this. It's everywhere in their dealings with the Pacific. And the messages are very clear coming out of Australia and New Zealand state broadcasting. The messages usually are, the women are like this, the guys are incompetent, all that sort of stuff. And you see it over and over, and there are 2 very clear messages that keep getting presented in the media. One is they're unstable. So here's an example of that sort of coverage. Tonga no confidence vote, a sign of instability. Actually, the attempted no confidence vote showed how stable the political system was. And we can, if anybody's interested, we can talk about what it actually meant. Here's another. Tonga moves on protection orders for victims of domestic abuse. This is another narrative that gets pushed a lot, which is that the men are very violent and there's a lot of domestic abuse. There is domestic abuse, but the rates are almost exactly the same as Australia and New Zealand. You can see how these stories develop over specific issues that are of interest to the New Zealand or Australian government. Recently, there was the case of China giving a plane to Tonga. China gave Tonga an MA-60 aircraft. It's an aircraft that has had some problems. There have been some crashes with the plane in, I think, in Myanmar and maybe Indonesia. It seems to be mostly pilot error, but there may actually be problems with the plane. But this is the way the coverage was. So first thing, New Zealand issued a traveler warning about all of Tonga over concerns with this aircraft. This is a domestic route aircraft. So if you're just going to the main island, which most people are, this doesn't affect you at all. New Zealand also cut off $8 million worth of tourism aid as a result of this aircraft. The story develops. So here's Radio Australia again. I put this in because the subtitle, Tonga New Zealand standoff over plane safety is understandable. And the subtitle is Tonga's hostile response to New Zealand's safety concerns over a Chinese-donated aircraft are perhaps understandable, according to a Tongan political scientist. That political scientist, by the way, is quoted in every second article used by Radio New Zealand about. There's few people that they go to deliver the same kind of message every time. And it's really interesting because usually with larger countries, you can't see those patterns. But because the Pacific is so small, you know exactly who they're dealing with. It also lets you, when we get to China, you'll see exactly who China is dealing with. So Tonga's hostile because they're saying, why are you taking away the tourism money, and if you're concerned about the plane, why aren't you helping make us safe? And then, of course, the third phase is Tongan community supports New Zealand's stand on MA-60 aircraft. Then they invoke the Tongans living in New Zealand to support the New Zealand government position. This is pretty standard. This sort of level of coverage happens on many, many issues. And by the way, that MA-60 that they're so concerned about is replacing the plane that was being run by a New Zealand company, and that plane was a DC-3, which celebrated its 75th birthday in Tonga. The other thing that they go at about Tonga, which is an easy target, but you could just as easily be applying it to the UK or to Canada, is the royal family. And this is a very clear, interesting example of why the local Australian-New Zealand media are so important for shaping points of view globally. So recently, 2 Tongan princesses married. One of them married a rugby player, one of them married a businessman. They married non-royals. And it was used as an opportunity by the Australian and New Zealand press to create this controversy. Tongan princesses sparked controversy with plans to marry commoners. There was no controversy. The king's mother attended the wedding. The crown prince attended the wedding. This was a non-issue. There was no problem in the Tongan community in New Zealand. There was no. But by the time this story gets abroad, this is what it looks like. Here's the Telegraph. Tongan princesses cause outrage by both marrying commoners. 2 Tongan princesses have left the royal family in disarray after snubbing tradition and opting to marry commoners. So this regional coverage is not benign. I was at dinner the other night, and somebody said, I heard there was instability in Tonga. I was like, where? I was there like a couple months ago. What was it? Tell me. So, because I'm concerned, I have friends there, But when you trace it back, it usually comes back to Radio New Zealand or Radio Australia, and it usually comes back to the same 3 Tongans, who I can name, that are quoted. And it's remarkable. And the other thing is that the way that the coverage happens, this Telegraph article was really interesting because it was reported just based on other web articles. I showed you the Radio Australia thing. So the Radio Australia one is at the top. The text is at the top. The Telegraph one is at the bottom. He lifted it straight off. He lifted it so much straight off that he even forgot to change the grammar. He cut out a whole section and he forgot to put in a period. He also distorted the quote by leaving things out to make it more sensational. You can, if anybody's interested, I can give it to you to compare the 2 quotes. This happens systematically. So, if you're reading the press, the Western press, you care about the region, reading the press, what you think about Tonga is that it's unstable, it's violent, and it's medieval. Okay? Which means, from an Australian or New Zealand perspective, it needs management. You need to turn to Australia and New Zealand to manage this incredibly unstable, violent area because otherwise, they'll be beating their women and the king will be, kidnapping his daughters if they don't marry who he wants. Okay? What it doesn't say, for example, is here is the current king of Tonga. He's the chancellor of the University of the South Pacific. Tonga has one of the highest per capita PhD rates. It has 100,000 people, so that kind of helps. But it's very highly educated, has been for generations. It's a complex society with a lot of depth to it. But that's not being reflected. So when the Tongans deal with Australians or New Zealanders, they're made to feel like beggars who are horrible to their people and have an unjust social system. So what happens? Hello, China. Hello, UAE. Hello, Kuwait. Hello, Russia. You know, the basic, this is you have to, if you're talking about China, you have to put in a Mao quote or a Sun Tzu quote. So here's my Mao quote. You know, when the enemy retreats, and this isn't an actual retreat, although you could say when the U.S. pulled out, it was a bit of a retreat, we pursue. So they moved in extremely effectively. This is that naval ship, Chinese naval ship that I mentioned before that pulled up into dock in Nuku'alofa, and they treat, Chinese policy is very complex, but at least at surface level, they treat people with respect. Very basic. And so here you go. Their logo is build friendship bridges to meet good friends. Now, China has invested an enormous amount in Tonga. It has by far the biggest, most complex embassy with some very dodgy satellite dishes at the back. And the question is, why? What does China see in this marginal place with very little resources that we don't? Well, it's not just Taiwan, right? There's the votes in international fora, which we kind of all know, and on this front, the Tongan Deputy Prime Minister has vowed to support China in all international fora, and IRENA is a case, we'll get to that later, but it's happening. I think there's also a strategic positioning perspective. We talk about the string of pearls. I think also as the first chain goes to the second chain, I think we're actually starting to see a bit of a Pacific wall going down. Now, whether that's completely benign or it's about something else is a very important thing that needs to be discussed. And some of these installations seem like they're commercial installations, but perhaps they're dual use. Then there's obviously things like seabed mining, fisheries, satellite launch slots, and there is a lot of money going through this area. As Admiral Locklear said in 2012 at the Pacific Island Forum in Apia, $5 trillion of commerce rides on the Asia-Pacific sea lanes each year, and you people are sitting right in the middle of it. This is not an inconsequential area. And we think of them as small countries because they have small landmass and small populations. But when you look at an exclusive economic zone map of the region, you realize that a country like Kiribati, which has maybe 100,000 people, has an exclusive economic zone the size of India. Now, that's a lot of seabed, fisheries, satellite launch slots, geostrategic positioning, and there are a lot of bases, U.S. bases, for example, already in the area. There was an issue in Kiribati. Kiribati used to recognize China. China set up what was probably a monitoring station in order to sort of see what the U.S. was doing a bit to the north. Kiribati switched to Taiwan and shut down the observation station. But it's an indication of what interests there are in the region. China I have an enormous amount of respect for Chinese foreign policy, and you see it particularly clearly when you get to the edges. The closer you are to China, the more complicated it is because the more lobbies are involved. But when you get out to a place like Tonga, you can sort of see much more, I think, the pure focus involved in engagement. And just to give an idea of kind of the China playbook, here's an example of how China has engaged with Tonga. So at the top, there are very deep, long-term business relationships with the elite. So specific members of the royal family have made money off of China and if you're China-friendly, it doesn't hurt your business, to put it mildly. In the middle, in under a decade, Chinese nationals have taken control of about 90% of the retail sector. At the bottom level, because of infrastructure projects, there's been a large-scale moving in of Chinese workers on infrastructure projects. This young engineer is standing in Nuku'alofa, building one of the new buildings in Nuku'alofa. In terms of bureaucracy, I think that there is specific targeted outreach and we can talk about this in the Q&A if you want a little bit more, to individuals in immigrations and customs. And there have been concerns over corruption is kind of the wrong word, but close relationships between people in specifically those two areas. And I've spoken with colleagues who look at Greenland, who look at Iceland and other areas, smaller countries which China engages with. This pattern is exactly the same. There's also targeted soft power. If you're a journalist in Tonga, no problem getting a scholarship. Anything from a free lunch to go study in China for 6 months. Versus you're lucky if you can get a visa to go visit your cousins in New Zealand. China gave every member of parliament in Tonga a new computer, which from a security perspective just kind of makes me shudder. But luckily, those guys don't use their computers for much except watching certain sorts of movies. So most of the computers ended up with the secretaries. There is very little ground level engagement, and this is before we sort of overhype how great China is. There's a very large problem with Chinese foreign policy, which is similarly a large problem with Chinese domestic policy, which is by not taking into account the concerns of the people on the ground, they're engendering a lot of anti-ethnic Chinese sentiment. And we see it in Tonga very clearly. This infrastructure that they're putting in is not great quality at all. In fact, one of the roads that they put it in with no drainage, so it's essentially, when it rains, a canal, and it's flooded all of the neighboring lands. The buildings that they've put in are definitely not up to earthquake code, and this is a Pacific Rim country. So there's some real problems with the infrastructure, and this is true also of the infrastructure that's put in a lot of places in Latin America and Africa, and I would expect over the next 5 to 10 years, some of that vaunted Chinese infrastructure is going to be killing people, and that's going to have an effect on how China is viewed. During the riots of 2006, and we can talk about them if you want, it was a complicated issue, but very interesting and dovetails with all of this other stuff. Chinese shops were targeted. Over 30 Chinese shops were burnt down. This is an example of one of the shops that was torched. And around 300 Chinese nationals had to be evacuated from the country by the Chinese government, which shows an interesting linkage between the overseas population and the government. And this had happened just a few months previously in the Solomon Islands, where again the Chinese government sent a plane to evacuate its citizens after an ethnic Chinese riot. There are regular robberies at these Chinese shops unless the family goes to church. And this kind of gets to the core of what the sentiment is in the Pacific about the Chinese community, which is that it actually doesn't want to engage with the wider community and it's keeping to itself. If there's an attempt to engage, there's a lot of latitude for moving within the society in a protected fashion. But it's not happening to a great degree, and so you get these. It's not considered a bad thing to rob a Chinese shop because the perception is the Chinese are robbing you. So it's a very destructive sort of relationship. Tonga has seen crime of the sort that it has never seen before. This woman is the first person in Tongan history to be convicted of human trafficking. She brought in two young Chinese women saying that they were going to work in a restaurant and forced them into prostitution for the Chinese laborers that were working on those infrastructure sites. And the only reason this came out was because one of them was stabbed and ended up in the hospital. She refused, and she was stabbed by one of the men and ended up in hospital, and it came out. And in court, she reported that her passport had been taken away, and she was told if she tried to complain, she would be chopped up and thrown in the ocean. Tongan society doesn't know how to deal with this. And the New Zealand police chief is more concerned about New Zealand visa fraud than he is about cracking these Chinese crime rings. And I think he's out of his depth. I think he wouldn't know how to do it anyway. We've seen kidnap, torture, murder, mostly Chinese community on Chinese community crime. It's unprecedented, and the society doesn't really know how to deal with it. So that's China. And this is happening all over the world. When Greenland was talking about bringing 2,000 to 3,000 Chinese laborers in to work on the aluminum smelter, the local mayor said, we better set up a brothel before they come, because we know this is going to be socially disruptive. So the Chinese engagement has political implications, but also social implications. But, and this is what I'd really like to make clear, this isn't just about China. Because of the relationship, the unhealthy relationship with Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific, all sorts of other players are coming in. And the case study that I'm going to use is the Tonga Energy Roadmap. Tonga did a very interesting thing. In 2008, a lot of the Pacific Islands were hit by energy price spikes that trashed their national economies. Suddenly, the hospitals were more expensive, the schools were more expensive, and they had a really hard time meeting national budgets because the prices had just jumped, and they're at the end of a very long supply chain. In the case of Tonga, the fuel goes to Singapore, and then it goes to Fiji, and then it finally ends up in Tonga, so it's extremely expensive. So they said, and there had been attempts of putting in place renewable energy. I think something like $20 million had gone into various solar panels or whatever over the last 20 years, and none of them worked. Because in many cases, it was donors fulfilling their own requirements, there wasn't proper training done, all that sort of stuff. So they said, Tonga said, very interesting, stop. Don't give us any more aid. We want to figure out what's wrong with our system. And then we'll figure out what we need to do to fix it. And then you can figure out how you want to plug into the plan that we're going to create. It was a reappropriation of the development process, and they did it in conjunction with the World Bank. So instead of dealing with 20 development partners, they dealt with the World Bank, and the World Bank dealt with all the other development partners, which meant that all of the interaction was supposed to be World Bank standard, transparency, all that kind of stuff. Very interesting, innovative plan. This was one of the first meetings of the development of the Tonga Energy Roadmap. They brought in people from all over, including the World Bank and things. And that's me looking very nervous because that's the Prime Minister. And I need to explain that I'm an associate fellow of Chatham House, but I was there in a kind of an independent capacity to peer review the project. So I've never been paid by any of the governments involved, and I've never actually been paid at all for any of the Tonga Energy Roadmap stuff. Very important to know where people get their money before you take their information. So the Tonga Energy Roadmap was an innovative and successful project. And it dovetailed with another really interesting international new organization, which is IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. IRENA was a brainchild of Germany, and it was largely thought of by Germany as a way of creating a new international organization that would promote renewables. And it just so happened Germany produced a lot of renewables. And it's an independent international organization, and there was a vote coming up for where it would be headquartered. And Germany assumed it would be headquartered in Germany. The UAE decided that they wanted it. So they sent a few planes around with a few sheiks and a few suitcases full of stuff, and signed up in part all of the Pacific Islands, or the majority of the Pacific Islands. And it came to the time for the vote in Sharm el-Sheikh, and Germany realized they didn't have the numbers. And so there was a lot of scrambling. The U.S. was very helpful in kind of brokering a compromise. But in the end, the headquarters for IRENA ended up in Abu Dhabi. And this was one of the first international organizations set up outside of the West. it is an indication of what is happening globally as non-Western countries come together to sideline the West for a whole range of different reasons. So you have the Tonga Energy Roadmap happening, and you have IRENA happening, and they came together. The Tonga Energy Roadmap became one of the first projects taken on board by IRENA. That's Princess Pilulevu, and that's me looking very nervous again because I'm near Princess Pilulevu. And I attended that meeting because there was clearly something else going on. And it was this wasn't just about renewable energy. And UAE has actually been very clear that they're using renewable energy and IRENA to broaden out their diplomatic engagement. And on the sidelines, or at the same time as one of the next UAE meetings, you had the first meeting between Arab League leaders and Pacific Island states. Now, that's not an inconsequential voting bloc to be creating relationships with. And they decided to choose, or basically Tongan leadership on renewable energy put Tonga in a point position for the negotiations with the Arab League. Tonga is actually very interesting in the context of its monarchy, because there is like a club of monarchs, and it's a whole other layer of political interaction that happens, and that makes countries like the UAE comfortable, because the government might come and go, but the king's always going to be there. So you cut a deal with the king, you know that's going to go through. It's not a dictatorship, but it's a very long-term relationship going forward. So Tonga became pivotal in this new kind of alliance. Right. So there's all of this activity happening. So what's Australia and New Zealand doing? Right? Well, New Zealand had viewed this new interest in renewable energy as a good way of advancing their own economic interests. And one way that they saw that they were going to do that was by using, they have a state-owned energy company called Meridian, and they wanted to set up a solar plant in Tonga that would be a showpiece to sell solar plants to the other 13 countries throughout the Pacific. Now, this article says Meridian to utilize solar expertise in Tonga. It had practically no solar expertise. I think it had some solar panels on like an airport in the U.S. And it had a lot of hydro expertise, but nothing. But they're very blunt about using Tonga as a launch pad for getting into the rest of the Pacific. And it actually says, so Meridian CEO says, this is an opportunity for Meridian to extend its solar program and build our capacity in the Pacific. Right? This is the first point entry. Now, the deal that Meridian brought to Tonga was Tonga would take out a loan in order to buy the solar panels and sign a power purchase agreement that would tie them into unspecified, not market-linked, potentially very high energy prices for a decade. Now, remember, term has come into place. So the World Bank takes a look at this and says, yeah, I don't think so. This does not make any sense as for anybody except Meridian and whoever you've signed the deal with in Tonga, and it was a previous political administration. And the World Bank says, look, okay, we don't want to rock the boat too much. We will give Tonga the money to pay for this plant, but if we give Tonga the money, then this goes to open bidding. Now, New Zealand has a plan. It wants to use Tonga to set up its solar footprint for the rest of the Pacific. So it says, okay, forget it. We'll donate the plant. So they donated the plant, and they set up the plant, and this isn't it. I don't actually have a picture of it. They put in the plant. It had no battery capacity and no electronic switching. So Japan very quietly stepped in and supplied another $6 to $8 million to actually make it functional. But New Zealand was determined to position itself as a renewable energy power in the Pacific, and I kind of found out later, partially, I think, why. Meridian Energy has just been proposed to be floated on with open share purchase in New Zealand. So it's a very narrow economic benefit for certain people in New Zealand that had the capacity to undermine the energy security of the entire Pacific, from my perspective. And if there are New Zealanders in the audience, I'd be very happy to be corrected. I really hope this isn't the case. Anyway, Tonga pursued, went on with its policy of creating a Pacific-based energy program. And one of the steps for that was to have a meeting. The other Pacific Island leaders said, everywhere we go, we keep hearing about the Tonga Energy Roadmap. You know, what is this thing? Tell us more about it. So Tonga said, okay, we're going to have a meeting, a 2-day meeting, where all of the Pacific leaders are invited to Tonga, and we'll tell them how the roadmap works. And New Zealand said, no. We're going to have a renewable energy expo, and you'll have a panel in Auckland where you can describe the Tonga Energy Roadmap. And Tonga said, no, we want to have our own meeting with Pacific Island leaders. And New Zealand said, okay, we'll fund it. Very close to the deadline for the conference to happen, New Zealand pulled their funding and assumed they wouldn't be able to hold the conference. So who stepped in with money? Any guesses? UAE. And the guest of honor were the people from Masdar. And here's that meeting with 8 Pacific heads of state talking to each other about how to create an indigenous system for renewable energy. And there I am looking very nervous over in the side because there are 8 heads of state standing in front of me at that moment. So the Tonga Energy Roadmap is moving along and is very successful. Now remember what we saw about the media in Australia and New Zealand? What do you think starts happening? Well, articles like this start happening. Questions over financial management of Tonga Energy Agency. Right? So suddenly they're saying, oh, it isn't audited. There's no audit for this thing. Meanwhile, the stories were, so this came out and this floated around for a while. And then finally, the Auditor General comes out and says, you guys are nuts. Why didn't you just ask me? You know, it's audited. In fact, it's audited by us, and it's audited by the World Bank, and it's audited by every single development partner. But by then, the story is out, and people at dinner parties tell me Tonga's unstable and is corrupt and financially. So now we're getting, with the energy story, we're getting up to this last week. The other thing that Tonga realized, Tonga understands, they've got some people who really understand how development works, which is how the Tonga Energy Roadmap came into play. But the thing that they just discussed with the other leaders was the other problem they have is they keep paying the same consultants $1,000 a day to do the same studies. So is there a way of getting around that? You know, if you're putting in a solar plant in Tonga and you're putting a solar plant in Samoa and you're putting is there anything you can sort of learn from each other? So Tonga proposed setting up a Pacific regional data repository where any study related to energy gets sent. So if you're from Tuvalu, you can see what Kiribati did. If you're from, and they're also proposing putting the contracts in, which would be very interesting because that would mean that everybody could see what everybody else paid. And that's what happened last week. This is the Prime Minister of Tonga handing over a signed agreement from the leaders of Pacific Island states to set up a Pacific Regional Data Depository. And at the dinner that evening, celebrating this accomplishment, which was a major accomplishment, the guest of honor was Sheikh Abdullah, the foreign minister of the UAE. And at the dinner, the Tongan Prime Minister handed Sheikh Abdullah a letter pledging Tonga's support for their 2020 World Expo bid. Now, this isn't just Tonga. Getting to the end. This isn't just Tonga. We know what's happened with Fiji. This is Bainimarama saying Fiji should align itself with visionary China instead of Australia and New Zealand. And Fiji isn't just talking. Fiji set up an entirely new regional organization, the Pacific Island Development Forum, in competition with the Pacific Island Forum, which they were expelled from by Australia and New Zealand, even though the U.S. has been very clear that they would like to see them included. They're one of the biggest players around. And we'll get to that later. And the Pacific Island Development Forum guests were, they got the Prime Minister of Timor-Leste, the President of Kiribati, the President of Nauru, the Prime Minister of the Solomons, the Vice President of FSM, and the special guests who helped bankroll this new forum were from China, Kuwait, Qatar, UAE, and Russia. This is happening all over the Pacific. This failure of Western engagement, which is supposed to be spearheaded by Australia and New Zealand, is resulting in all sorts of things like this happening, but including PACER Plus is this regional trade agreement. Papua New Guinea has announced that they will pull out of it. They've called it a waste of time. And they are very blunt. This is from the Trade Minister of Papua New Guinea. Our feelings at the moment is that PACER Plus would be one-sided in favor of Australia and New Zealand. We're frustrated with them. We can't export our taro there. They won't accept our greens. There's nothing to be gained from a trade agreement at the moment. We cannot justify the huge amount of resources we expend on such negotiations. They're a complete waste of time. The Pacific Islanders are saying what they want. They want to sell their taro. They want small levels of access to marketplace so that they can afford, the poorest of the poor can afford to pay their school fees. Like, it's not complicated, and it actually doesn't really take that much. So what's been happening why am I coming here and saying this? Why, they've been very loud about it. Why does it take a Canadian to come to Washington to start to bring up some of these issues? Part of the reason is that a lot of the analysis that comes out of the region is coming out of Australia and New Zealand, or it's coming out of using Australia and New Zealand press sources as things. And I'm very sorry, I know we have some colleagues from CSIS in the audience, but just to give an example of what ends up getting bounced around Washington, this was CSIS's coverage of the Pacific Island Development Forum. Pacific Island Development Forum, keep calm and carry on. Basically, no requirement for change of policy. It's okay. It'll burn itself out. But when you start to see what's actually happening in the region, you realize this is the crest of a very big wave. And it raises another very tricky question, which I'd be really interested if anybody in the audience wants to talk about, which is, what is Australia? Now, Australia is considered to be a very strong Western ally in the Pacific, that we are trusting with the management of, a sixth of the Earth's surface. And we are trusting to give, very good analysis. And they're very smart people in Australia. And there are people in Australia I've spoken with who know all of this and who are very concerned. And there are people in state here who know all of this and who are very concerned. There are also people in Australia who think that their economic future lies with China, and who are willing to shift their strategic approach in order to make friends. I don't think it's necessary when you're dealing with China, but that's another story. And this isn't just conjecture. There was, I know I'm not supposed to use WikiLeaks, but in this case, I didn't have any other way of getting this information publicly. There was one of the cables said very clearly, I'll just read it. The leaked cables report that Australia pushed Nauru to break ties with Taiwan and open diplomatic relations with China. However, notwithstanding Australia's status as Nauru's largest aid donor, Mr. Scotty considered that is none of Australia's business and has resisted. So Nauru is resisting and holding loyal to Taiwan when Australia is pushing it towards China. There's no strategic advantage to the U.S. for Australia to be pushing Nauru towards China. So what is this? There's no strategic advantage to the U.S. to expel Fiji from the forum, or to continue to have Fiji outside of the forum. especially given the relationships that Fiji is developing with other countries. At the end of the last forum, Fiji signed an agreement with North Korea. I mean, they're moving. They're saying enough is enough. And this gets back to for us to understand, everybody to understand, what is the Pacific now? I started off by saying Tonga was at the edge of the map. The Pacific is at the edge of the map. That's the map we're used to seeing. When you look at the map like this, you realize that the Pacific is in the center of a lot of very growing economies, a lot of trade routes, a lot of strategic positioning. China knows where the Pacific is. It's not at the edge of the map. It's at the center of routes between South America and China, between Australia and North America. This is actually not a thin point. This is a new pivot. And currently, unless we understand that in this room, you're going to have a situation where we are losing friends unnecessarily. And it doesn't take much. The people of the Pacific are naturally West-oriented. Many have family in the U.S. or Australia or New Zealand. They speak English for the most part. They're family-oriented. They're faith-oriented. All things that China can't provide, for example. China's one-child policy has destroyed its sense of the importance of a large extended family community. China's rejection of religion has alienated faith-based communities in the Pacific. This is not a natural alliance. This is an alliance that happened because of failure to engage equitably on our side. And it wouldn't take much to rebuild those relationships. For example, direct flights. There used to be a flight that used to go from New Zealand to Tonga to Samoa to LA, which meant you could go from Tonga straight to visit your relatives in Salt Lake City. That flight was flying at 90% capacity. Air New Zealand killed that flight. Now, if you want to go to LA from Tonga, you have to go back through New Zealand and then onward, which means in many cases you need to apply for a visa from New Zealand, which means New Zealand has a chokehold on your mobility. Market access, the Papua New Guinea guy. Papua New Guinea has an enormous amount of resources. They're not talking about getting their resources into markets. They're talking about getting their taro into markets. If you start selling Tongan watermelons in LA, they won't need China. If people can feel economically secure, they won't be turning to other places. And, then there's the usual educational exchanges, etc. It really, really doesn't take much. This is a natural relationship. But the longer we wait, and the more they get used to dancing to the tune of other countries, the harder it's going to be to reclaim our position and to create a secure, stable Pacific for the people of the Pacific and for the larger region that is now, as we see, a very central one going forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting, and there's certainly a lot of provocative elements in there and interesting elements to tease out. So we have a great audience, and so rules as I said at the beginning, but I'll remind folks who may have come in later in the back, this is on the record and being webcast, so just be aware of that for Q&A. I don't think you covered so many interesting things. I must say I've never been to a Pacific Islands program in which we didn't hear the phrase climate change, but I think we'll probably come back to that in the discussion. Let's open it up. Please, please identify yourself and your affiliation and just...
Lisa Friedman, I write for Climate Wire, so I'll say the word. We're an energy policy magazine here. Thank you. This is so interesting. Can you bring climate change into the mix? Obviously, all of these small island nations, including Tonga, are very worried about the impacts of climate change on their islands. What are they seeing from China, from the UAE, that is different than what they're seeing from Australia, New Zealand, and the U.S.? How does this dynamic work in the climate talks?
Pacific are extremely varied. So the concerns of Kiribati are not necessarily the concerns of Tonga. But what the Pacific Island negotiators have discovered is that climate change is a really good thing to bring up if they're hoping to get some sort of funding for various things. So assessing the actual impacts, you really need to go from country to country. The Tonga Energy Roadmap was originally designed to deal with energy security concerns because of the price spike of 2008. So yes, it's going low carbon, but the initial impetus for that was to create a stable energy cost for the consumer. The situation with Kiribati is much, much more dire. As you know, they have a kind of average elevation of about 6 feet. And it brings into play a lot of complex strategic concerns. We talked about now how Kiribati recognizes Taiwan, for example. Well, according to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, if you have an island, you can claim a 200-mile exclusive economic zone around the island. It's unclear what happens if the island disappears. Do you lose that exclusive economic zone? And this is an issue already in the South China Sea with one of the Japanese, all sorts of things. But if the entire country needs to be evacuated, as Kiribati has already discussed, and Kiribati is in the process of negotiating a land purchase in Fiji, if it has to move its population, does the country legally cease to exist as a country? Do its waters revert to international waters? Does it lose its seat in the UN? And in that process, it recognizes Taiwan, which has been strategically helpful to the U.S. If it moves to Fiji, which is definitely working nicely with China, will it have to change its foreign policy in the process? So will you be able to armor some of those islands that have been evacuated by Kiribati citizens and set up a Chinese base, which helps fund your relocation? The law is really unclear around a lot of this, but as we've seen in the context of IRENA, we may have originally set up these international organizations like the IMF or the World Bank, but increasingly the rest of the world is saying this does not benefit us, and we're going to set up our own organizations. And in the case of these very fuzzy points that aren't made clear in the Unconventional Law of the Sea, for example, it may end up being a might is right or a regional compact or that sort of thing. So the implications are extremely complex and very interesting and very troubling.
Anyone else? The others who want to come in. I didn't quite understand because I'd never heard of IRENA before today. Is it an international organization? So it has an international body reviewing the mechanisms, the work, the funding. I couldn't understand how it could be taken over.
It has a council.
Okay.
Yeah, and Tonga is on the council.
Okay.
Right.
How many members are on the council? All the UN
No,
members?
no,
Or?
no. It's not a UN organization.
It's not a UN.
Yeah, it's a separate. It's an interesting organization worth discussing and looking at. It's a standalone international organization which had one of the fastest ratifications of any international organization, because who wants to be left out of renewable energy? And I think there's like 135 member countries or something like that. And there's a relatively small council, I can't remember. And because the Pacific was so instrumental, and Tonga in particular was so good at bringing together the Pacific votes to locate IRENA in the UAE, Tonga got a position on the council. They're 2-year-long positions. But the other thing it did was it negotiated a dedicated seat on the council for the Pacific Islands. Now, normally the Pacific Islands need to share the international allocation with other big countries and get pushed to the side. Obviously, some of the other big countries are not so pleased about this, but Tonga has had the seat for 2 years. It was renewed for another 2, and Fiji will take it over next. The other thing is Fiji. I mean, I didn't really talk about it much, but the perception that Fiji is isolated is inaccurate. So Fiji didn't sign that Pacific Regional Data Repository thing because it contained wording that had come from Pacific Island Forum document. So it felt like it couldn't sign. But it attended the meeting and it came to the dinner to show that, okay, we've got these little disagreements and we know why, because it has to do with these other countries, but we are sticking together as a family.
Yes, please.
Chris Doyle from CSIS. How do you see things playing out with Fiji over the next year? There's proposed elections for late next year. We've seen a previous instance of proposed or promised elections not taking place. Do you think it's inevitable now that Western countries will start diplomatically recognizing Fiji? Do you think there's possible contingencies based on how those elections go, that things could go awry from here?
Yeah, the Australians have already said they'd like to normalize relations, and the only countries that have been blocking normalized relations have been Australia and New Zealand. So I would hope that Fiji is brought back into the family of nations, regardless of what happens with the election, in part because Bainimarama needs an exit strategy. And if we don't provide one where he doesn't think he's going to end up in The Hague or in jail, it becomes much more difficult to have a transition. So understanding the concerns, the concerns of the individuals involved, and not just bullying and pushing and all that sort of stuff. I mean, I personally think that the Australian and New Zealand position has extended the military rule in Fiji. I don't think he wanted to be stuck there, and in fact, it's a very interesting coup. I mean, the background to the coup is sort of interesting, but it's not a normal military coup, right? It had to do basically with not wanting to deprive the rights of the Indo-Fijians. It's like a really, like kind of a human rights-based coup, but it kind of spiraled out of control after that. So I would like to see normalization. I think as we see, the longer you wait, the more other players are going to use Fiji to come into the region, and the worse it is for the region and for general security.
Clarify one point. As a result of the coup, the United States also was required to impose certain sanctions and restrictions, and hopefully after elections, which are internationally accepted and considered to be relatively free and fair, we hope to normalize positions fully also.
Thank you. Yeah, and the two issues are important. One is what I talk about mostly is the boycott from the forum, but the sanctions is a kind of a whole separate set of. It brings in the wider region, so it's useful to make that clarification. Yeah.
Dick here next. And then
So loosely CSIS. Looking at things historically, not all of this is brand new. For example, the Chinese built a stadium in Vanuatu for the South Pacific Games back in the late 80s, early 90s, and made themselves quite unpopular in the process. That is, Vanuatu got a showcase, but everything was done by imported Chinese labor, left very little with the economy. They all cleared out again. Another historic trend, Australia and New Zealand, at least through the end of the 80s, were quite reluctant to get into the business of managing the Pacific for themselves or anyone else. They didn't really know what to make of the coup in Fiji in 87. And I would argue that it was only really with East Timor in 98 that they began to develop their more policeman-like role, if you will, there in Solomons and elsewhere. So
that's very useful to.
And I know all about the attitudes toward the two countries from the locals. Not always very good, as you see.
It's very useful to have some larger context because if they don't really want to, I mean, right now I see no desire to not be involved. So I don't know what else has come into play since then, but yeah.
No, I think now they are.
Yeah, and they don't seem to want to divest or to let anybody else in. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, please. Hi. My name is Tim Westmeyer. I work at the Elliott School, the Seeker Center for Asian Studies at GW.
I was wondering if you've seen some of these trends affecting maritime security in the region. You talked about the importance of all the various trade routes, and you started with the picture of China bringing in some of its military fleets. Has any of that dynamic changed in terms of various countries' responsibilities, and how do you kind of see that moving forward, since it seems to be a very important region for trade?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and it's a very big area. So what happens in the north, what would happen with Micronesia might be very different than what happens with Tonga. The main concern for the Pacific Islanders is illegal fishing. Other countries may have other concerns. I was in Nauru once. Australia has said that it sort of covers the illegal fishing stuff with these overflight, flying over and taking a look, basically. I mean, I don't know why they have to do that with satellites, but anyways, so that was. But I was in Nauru when this plane load of Australian Air Force guys came in, and they had made their hotel reservation 3 months in advance. So if you're an illegal fishing nation, you knew where those planes were, and it seemed very much kind of checking a box. Now, very recently, they've announced that some countries in the Pacific will try to coordinate much more with policing of illegal fisheries, and that's an area where the U.S. would be extremely welcome from the Pacific Islands. I don't know what the U.S. would do if they caught an illegal Chinese trawler fishing in Kiribati waters. Because, then you have do you stop the ship? Do you stop the ship? What do you do? And that's one of the reasons why there hasn't been big nation support for defense of fisheries, because if you catch the bad guys, you have a political problem. In terms of maritime transit, I don't know what China is really doing with its major commercial fleet and its port management and the buying up of customs in various different countries. I hope it's all just to help trade and not dual use. But I wouldn't, if I was China and I had the opportunity to maximize my investment, I would use things that looked civilian to accomplish multiple goals.
There may be others. I just have one question. You mentioned Japan very briefly.
Yeah.
In the context of that solar project, as I recall, that was trying to be established. Can you say some more about what Japan, because I understand Japan has been more engaged, has an annual meeting with the Pacific Island countries. Could you say a little bit more about its assistance and diplomacy?
Japan has a complicated historical relationship with the Pacific, so a lot depends on which countries it's engaging with. But because it is aware of its complicated historical relationship with some of the islands in the Pacific, it tends to try to keep a very low profile. It does, of all of the major countries, in Tonga, for example, that I've seen engage from a development perspective with Tonga, it's by far the most helpful. Mm-hmm. It built a hospital, it fixed the solar plant, but it's very low key. So you see the payback sort of come at whaling meetings and kind of minor things like that, but it's not really using that. But JICA does actually a very good job throughout the Pacific. But I think because of concerns over being perceived to be something else, Japan has been pulling back. And I actually think it would be good to see Japan getting more engaged. In fact, if Japan set up a Pacific Island policy think tank in conjunction with the U.S. or something, it might be a very beneficial way of developing new leaders, new ideas for these new times.
Yes, Mitzi.
Hi, I'm Mitzi Picard of Asia America Initiative. You talked about the riots, the Chinese riots. I don't know much about them. Was it because the Chinese were just taking over the business and all that? So I wanted more elaboration on that. And also, in terms of Chinese development, do they actually transfer technology or do they just take over? Because I know there's been some criticism of the way China has been handling its assistance in Africa. Wondering if that's the same thing with the Pacific Islands.
Yeah, there's been, I mean, as was mentioned with Vanuatu, they'll bring in populations to build stuff and then hopefully leave. But what we're seeing increasingly is some of the population seems to stay behind. And I mean, I've one friend in government said that in Tonga that they've had problems with multiple Chinese coming in on the same passport. So you would have 10 Chinese come into the country, one Chinese leaves with 10 passports, and that same Chinese comes back with 9 new people, right? So in a country as small as Tonga, it's sort of hard to hide a very large population. But in places like Siberia, I don't know if you talk to the Russians about this, but they have no idea how many Chinese nationals are in Siberia because they come in all sorts of different ways. So there's no transfer of technology, but there may be transfer of population. And also, when you come to a place like Tonga, they tend to move on. So they'll use it as a kind of, they'll get a Tongan passport and then apply to move to the U.S. or move to New Zealand with that new identity. Because the other thing is that the Chinese embassy is not helpful at all about giving background information on who's coming into Tonga. And Tonga has no money to deport. So if that woman that was caught for trafficking, the Tongans would have loved to just ship her back to China. But China was like, we've never heard of her. We're not going to help you get her back to China. So she's sitting in a Tongan jail.
She was Chinese.
She was Chinese. Well, she was...
Chinese citizen.
I don't know if she was a Tongan national or not. The other thing is that Tonga was selling passports for around the Hong Kong handover time, about $20,000 to $25,000 until it was stopped. I mean, Tonga's not perfect, right? You know, no country is perfect. In terms of the riots, I mentioned 2 different riots: the one in the Solomons and the one in Tonga. The one in the Solomons was a reaction to new Chinese populations coming in and getting prime pieces of land, in part. I mean, there was a lot of other social discontent, and there was the perception that those Chinese who were getting new land had been accorded that favor because they had bought off political leaders, certain political leaders, including during the election, the people who came in. So it was a perception of, you know, you're messing with our internal politics and you're getting benefits from it. In the case of Tonga, I personally think they were actually primarily collateral damage. So the riots were. Do we have New Zealanders in the room? Okay, I'm about to make you apoplectic, and I apologize in advance. I'll take you out for a drink afterwards. There's the monarchy, the royal system in Tonga is built around land ownership. Okay, so the crown owns all of the land, and the nobility administers it. And so if you're a Tongan male, and they've had a constitution since the 1870s, and according to the constitution, every Tongan male has the right to about 8 acres in the countryside and a plot of land in the city, which is a built-in food security system for Tonga. What that means is you can't sell land. Right? So you can lease land, you can come as a foreigner and lease land, but you can't sell it, you can't use it as collateral, that sort of thing. That's not very beneficial if you're Australian agribusiness. It's very fertile land. It's got it's pretty good land. So part of the objection to the monarchic system from the business sectors is the land component, is not being able to have access to the land. Now, there was a very big kind of democracy movement that was overtly and strongly backed by Australia and New Zealand. And one particular leader, this guy called Akalisi Pohiva, who's now a member of parliament, who got funding. I mean, nobody can really say where his funding came from. And there were camps of these kind of these pro-democracy guys who were plied with alcohol and fired up with anti-monarchy speeches and torched the town. The primary target was businesses owned by the king and the royal family. I don't think anybody intended it to go quite that far. but these guys are basically street thugs, and they were the ones who were chosen to lead kind of this movement. Yeah, I don't know if I'm ever going to get to go back to Tonga now. These are national heroes in the Tongan context, but looking at from the outside, there's been no policy initiative. It's just been, and these are actually the guys that are usually interviewed in the New Zealand and Australian media. And when I asked a New Zealand colleague, okay, you've destroyed the economy of this country or your people have trashed the economy. Why didn't you come in with money to help rebuild? And the person said, we wanted the elite to twist in the wind. They wanted to squeeze the elite and get a political change as a result. What happened? China came in with about an $80 million loan to rebuild the city. And the loan was structured in a very interesting way. The money was all stayed with the China Export-Import Bank. So you needed to use it to, first of all, it was renminbi denominated, which is very interesting because China's doing this all over the place, I think in part to help bolster the renminbi as a global reserve currency. But the other thing that happened was they went to the government, but through the government it was lent to big constituencies who had lost properties, like the church. And so when the loan comes up for renegotiation, you have strong domestic constituencies, like the church, putting pressure on the government to be nice to China so that they don't call in the loan.
Are they concessional rates or are they market rates?
Yeah, they're concessional. And there was no interest for the first 5 years, and they're suddenly coming due.
And you use them to buy Chinese product services?
You use them to buy Chinese people who come and labor. They were importing rocks into Tonga. Everything comes into Tonga. And this is the thing about those Chinese projects like the one in Vanuatu. You can negotiate a better deal with China. People, you don't have to give in. People get good deals from China, but because the countries are so desperate at the time that they're turning to China because their allies have let them down, they end up with these really bad deals. So this pro-democracy movement ended up putting Tonga in hock to an authoritarian regime. But our colleague disagrees. Yeah. Okay.
Did you want to come in?
Right.
Did you have a comment or question?
Yes. On Congressional Research Service. Technically on furlough today. I have two questions. One is, has the U.S. rebalancing policy touched the Pacific at all? And my second question is, what sorts of resources, whether they be news resources or scholarly centers, where do we get more good coverage of the Pacific when we're doing research?
I'd like to come in on that.
Do you want to just go?
I would like to ask a direct question. I'd like to flag the Pacific Islands Development Program at the East-West Center, which is located in our headquarters in Honolulu, is a program that does a lot of work, and they issue a Pacific Islands report every morning on events around the Pacific. For those of you who are interested in keeping tabs on developments, news from the region, I recommend that, and obviously a whole host of a range of different types of studies, peer-reviewed to books length to analytical, including our new Pacific Island Climate Change Report, which was just issued and launched up in the Senate about 2 weeks ago. So that's one source, but I'll leave Cleo there.
Yeah, and actually East West Center, you also run a journalist training program from the Pacific.
And leadership training for Pacific Island folks.
Yeah.
Including a State Department funded one.
Yeah. The only problem with that is that journalists who are not writing in the normal narrative, the instability, domestic violence narrative, find it difficult to get published in the mainstream press because they're perceived as being biased or not really. I mean, I'm not talking about the work you're doing. I'm talking about in Australia or in New Zealand. I mean, I've been attacked in the New Zealand press. It's not, there's the changing or having another layer of assessment to another layer to the assessment is not comfortable for a lot of people. So there are some good people out there. Personally, I think it actually would be important to set up a policy think tank in the Pacific that is not run by Australia or New Zealand, but is run by Pacific Islanders, that would allow these kind of multitude of opinions to come to the fore, because they know it. Everything I've said, every Tongan knows. But they're not allowed to communicate unless you're Papua New Guinea and you've got so many resources, you don't really care what anybody thinks, and so you can say it very bluntly as you walk out of the Pacer Plus negotiations. So creating a forum that would help the voices come forward, and as those kind of delicate little voices come forward and grow into stronger voices, give them the opportunity to have access to a wider range of inputs. The rebalancing, I think I know Tonga best, so there have been kind of more visits from military medical ships, some more military to military. The Tongan troops are deployed in Afghanistan, so there is an existing relationship, although they're actually run out of the UK. So they were implicated in some of the problems at Camp Bastion, for example, recently. So the military to military seems to be increasing, which is beneficial and which helps. And the Tongans love it when the U.S. shows up, but there's no representation. There's no permanent diplomatic U.S. representation in Tonga. There's Peace Corps workers, but there's nobody to talk to. There's nobody to invite to the cocktail parties.
Is there anyone else who I've missed? Yes.
Yes, we'll go to you.
Chris Feddersen of the East West Center. As the soft power, especially of tourism, starts to shift from North America to Asia, are the Pacific governments, the countries prepared? I mean, it's easy money for the governments and Chinese construction and everything that goes along with that. Are the people prepared if the government starts to make it possible for larger waves of Asian tourists to come? What will happen to ordinary citizens?
I'll just flag our work on Micronesia and tourism.
Let's just read it quickly before I answer your question. Again, as with Lisa's question, the region is extremely varied, so I think it kind of depends to a large degree on the location. I was at an event in London with the Tongan Prime Minister and his economic team talking to investors from the city. And they're saying, look, we're open for business. Please come. We'll write laws. We'll let you, we need investment. And the two Chinese business representatives in the audience both wanted to know if Tonga was going to allow gambling. And casinos. And the Tongan said, look, we can't. This is because of our religious beliefs, this is not possible. If they get Baroque enough, who knows? Tonga probably not. But when you start to see things like casinos going in, you know that there's a real breakdown going on.
Yeah. I think maybe this will be the last one, unfortunately. Yes.
My name's Marie Newson. I'm a lawyer from New Zealand, and I studied in New York.
Just speak up a little bit so we can get you on the podcast.
I'm currently working for a law firm in New York, but my background is in New Zealand. And I worked for a law firm that advised the Tongan government, but also the Solomon Islands government. And some of the sort of events that you've mentioned tonight were sort of things that were going on while I was working. And the dynamics, I don't presume to know everything that was going on, but there were definitely some frustrations, I think, among people working in New Zealand in particular that I worked with, who found that because they were under-resourced, because they didn't have the finance to really do a good job, they did the fastest job, and the fastest job was to cut and paste what they knew how to do. And
are you sure you're talking about from the Tongan side?
No, from the New Zealand side.
From the New Zealand side.
From the New Zealand side. So I've got one comment and two questions for you. One comment was that I totally agree on the media, and I also found that very frustrating. The same thing happens with stories from all around the world. We get stories just copied off international sites. The grammar's not changed, it's still American spelling. So the Pacific is not alone in being sort of misrepresented in that way. But the firm that I was involved in was actually involved in a challenge to some of the stories that were being posted about Samoa and other Pacific Island countries.
But just to clarify, they're not. Australia and New Zealand is writing the original stories. They're not cutting and pasting. It's coming from them.
I'm just saying, you commenting on the fact that the stories are picked up in the UK and in the US, carte blanche, and the same thing happens in New Zealand coming in the other direction. The two questions I have for you.
Very quickly, New Zealand has no policy control over the places where they're doing their cutting and pasting stories from. So if they get if New Zealand media is cutting and pasting a story about Kyrgyzstan, it has no policy implications. But if London is seeing a distorted story about the Pacific, it's going to affect how London is interacting with the Pacific, and they have the clout to actually make a difference there. So it's not quite the same.
The point I wanted to make is that I'm doubtful about the quality of New Zealand media in general.
Yeah.
And I think that the Pacific, you're absolutely right, the Pacific suffers because the main outlet for information about the Pacific is through New Zealand and Australia, and it's a weak link. The two questions I have for you, one is around the land issue, which you mentioned for Tonga, and my concern with land in the Pacific Islands is that there has been quite a lot of emphasis from AusAid and from New Zealand Aid as well, and other aid agencies in the region to convert land to economic benefit, and which is code for turn into a commercially viable, sort of tradable commodity. Do you have any insights on how that dynamic is changing, sort of the interaction with not just New Zealand and Australia, but is it encouraging the Pacific to turn towards other partners?
Well, in the case specifically of Tonga, I don't know if people in the room realize this, but New Zealand Aid and now AusAid are actually part of the Ministries of Foreign Affairs. They're not standalone aid. They are part. Australia's about to make that switch, but New Zealand has made that switch. And the job of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in part, is to promote the business of your country. And you can see that in the sort of things you're talking about. You need to commercialize your land. You're not. This is, anti-WTO. This is not, all this sort of stuff. Whereas from a island perspective, this is the only safety net they have. And this is a very good example of how short-term benefits for Australia and New Zealand have the potential to destabilize stable countries. And I think the same is true for Australia's refugee policy. Australia might be a little bit better off if it doesn't have to deal with these people. But if you take a country like Nauru, which is on the borderline to begin with, and you dump a bunch of people there, it affects the whole society. Because if you're a Nauruan prison guard, and you see this sort of relationship, it's like the sort of Stanford prison experiments. It changes you, and it filters down through the society. So I think that what you're talking about with the land is part of that process. It has the potential to destabilize, and I think the countries in the region definitely realize that. And in the case of Tonga, where land is tied to the political structure, they realize it even more, which is why you get the pro-democracy guys going after the nobility when they're trying to go after actually something else. Or maybe their funding is going after something else. So I think it's a very important point. Whether it actually forces people to find new partners, maybe in the context if China's not going to bring it up. No other people won't keep bringing it up. But it certainly shows, from a Pacific perspective, if somebody comes to you and says that, they're showing their hand. And it affects the way that you feel about them, for sure. Yeah, it's a good point. Was there a second question?
The second question is just, I always like to know, is there anything you think that Australia and New Zealand are doing well? And what is it that makes you think that's working and other things aren't?
I think there are a lot of good programs, institutional programs in place, which is why on paper it doesn't really look like there's a problem. But the people that have been put in the positions, and many of whom have been dealing with the Pacific for a very long time, and who have somewhat out-of-date attitudes towards humanity in general. If different people were put in those positions, you might get a completely different outcome. New Zealand, we were actually talking about this before. New Zealand talks about its relationship with the Maori and how that gives it an added understanding of the Pacific. I've never seen a Maori representative in any of the Pacific Islands. So you've got a lot of the institutions are there, but they're being used, the motivation, if it realized that this is actually undermining Australia and New Zealand's security and economic development. The other thing is, if you let the economies of the Pacific grow, that money is going to flow right back to Australia and New Zealand. So there's actually no economic benefit, there's no security benefit, there's no international prestige benefit from continuing along this path. So you can use the same structures, shift your motivation, put in people who can actually make those connections and show some respect, and I think you get a very different outcome.
Thank you, Cleo. Before we I'm afraid we have to draw it to a close, but let me just make a couple of announcements about upcoming events. One is on October 9th next week on aid dependence in Cambodia. We have Dr. Sofil Ear from the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, who has a new book on the relationship between aid dependency and Cambodian domestic politics, particularly democratization. And on October 23rd, I know that's a bit off, but we have Ambassador Jonathan Adelton, who was our former ambassador to Ulaanbaatar. He'll be coming to speak about the United States and Mongolia's current state of relations. There have been some interesting announcements on the U.S.-Mongolia front. So for those of us, of you who'd like to join. But let me just turn back to Cleo and say, I failed to do this. She also has a book on energy, environmental, economic, and political crises. But that's a different book, so we'll look forward to your next one. And we thank you very much for what I, at least not following Pacific Islands, found to be an extremely intriguing and interesting presentation. I know there was a lot of participation from the floor, so we look forward to your next book and your next assessment on this. And so please join me in thanking Cleo.
Thank you very much.